Good evening, and thanks for joining us tonight for another episode of Rich Politics. Yes, we're in the middle of a mini-series on lockdown harms, and in the first of our series, we discussed the economical impact that lockdowns had. Last week, we spoke to Trudy, a mother who tragically lost her son, who took his own life during lockdown, and her pain that she carries to this day as a result of some of the restrictions and lockdowns imposed by the government. But tonight we're doing something different. We're going to be looking at the political impact, and we're joined by Baroness Claire Fox, who has literally tirelessly campaigned for social and civil liberties and has been a consistent voice in the House of Lords on the harms of lockdown. Claire, let me first of all ask you, were lockdowns a political decision?
I don't think that they were taken in the way that you sit around and go, what's our policy? I actually think that they were, in some ways, the consequence of a panicky government that was facing, if we remember, it's a long time ago, an unknown virus, didn't really know what to do. Their initial instincts were not to lock down. But I do think that over a period of time and a lot of hassle, a lot of clamoring by the mainstream media and opposition parties saying you must do something, they looked around the world, they panicked, and they did an unprecedented thing, which was to close down society. I think that initial reaction and that response was wrong, but it's also the case that as a short-term, sharp issue, it might have been something to experiment with. Well, what they then did was they got on almost like it was like a treadmill. They were over precautionary, under a huge amount of pressure from also the science, because they were politicians. They didn't know what this virus was. And they elevated these scientific experts who said this was the way to go. And then they got stuck on the precautionary principle, always see the worst possible scenario. And in that sense, I suppose they made a decision that became political. And the reason why I'm always a bit hesitant on this, but I don't think they sat around and said, great, let's accumulate a huge amount of power, deprive people of civil liberties and use this virus for nefarious ends. I think that would be a wrong reading.
But there are some that have used that as an accusation. They've said, it's part of a big power grab and moving towards this social credits ID and all that, the idea of controlling the masses through a political strategy. I mean, there were people who thought that was what was happening, didn't they?
Well, they still think it. I mean, people at the moment are interpreting everything through that prism. It would be naive to not say that there was an element of power grab, because obviously if you're in government and you actually can attribute more power to yourself and be less accountable, it's a temptation, and governments do that all the time. But what I suppose I don't think was as they planned it that way, but they were opportunistic. There are also other trends that existed much before COVID. I mean, sometimes people act as though COVID was year zero and nothing had happened before that. There's been attacks on civil liberties, attacks on free speech, attacks on things like our privacy when it came to digital matters. For years, I've been having rows with people in public health about the fact that they wanted to use nudge, that they wanted to use digital information gathering to target what they would see vulnerable people in terms of healthcare. All of those things were already going on. It's just that people didn't notice. And of course, they used COVID as an excuse to then say, oh, look, we have to do it.
Well, you've been very outspoken over the last 2 years since the lockdown began. I know I've seen many clips of you at the House of Lords on some of the disproportionate aspects of the lockdowns, because clearly for me personally, and for a lot of people that I've been speaking to, and we're doing this mini series on the harms of lockdown, the people I've been speaking to said, look, we understand that the first lockdown needed to happen. We didn't know what it was. We've mentioned that. But moving on from there, certain decisions that were made in the context of Wales in particular here as well, and the devolved administrations, and in Westminster, that didn't make any sense to people, Claire, did they?
No, I mean, it was completely disproportionate. It was almost as though the more we got to know about the virus and how to control it, the more irrational the policy decisions were in relation to it, because not knowing at the beginning is one thing, but as they began to know, it was obvious that some of the more draconian measures that they were taking were not going to be any help in stopping the virus. So I think it did become a matter of control then, what they perceived to be a public health emergency. They wanted control so that they could basically decide what it was that happened at any given time. And it was easier to do that once you demobilize people. I mean, the theme of today is what is the political consequences in a way, what happened politically. And I think one of the worst things that happened for me, Rich, was that they demobilized the public. You know, they could have said, right, we're going to close down a lot of society, but there's all these people who are volunteering and offering to help, and maybe we could kind of create a volunteer army. But they preach to us, and this is a lesson that I think is going to have deep consequences for many years, that the way to be active politically was to do nothing. Right. I mean, that was the message, right? Sit at home, take instructions. And that kicks the stuffing out of people. And they lose confidence in their capacity to be change makers in a way, to do anything active. So, you know, they called it a war against a virus, but at least in a war, you were mobilized. Whereas they had a war, well, it wasn't a war, but they called it a war. They treated it as though loose talk cost lives. All of that kind of rhetoric was used. And they demobilized us. They told us to do absolutely nothing. Yeah. And that was very damaging, I think.
Yeah, and I think on the free speech issue as well, any dissenting voices against lockdown, I mean, I know they've gone over old ground here. You know, they were demonized as anti-lockdowners, anti-vaxxers, the usual stuff that, you know, a lot of people got used to hearing. And clearly, it was just people asking genuine questions about what they felt was disproportionate and didn't feel, you know, that it was right for them to, you know, to comply to some of these regulations that were legislated for. I mean, do you think that really damaged the credibility of our politicians as well?
Absolutely, totally. It's had a devastating impact. And it's meant that we now have a situation where nobody believes anything that anyone says, which is very nihilistic and dangerous situation to be in. But you know, when you remember I can barely believe that this actually happened to us. It's like a nightmare. You look back, you think, did that really happen? We weren't allowed to talk to each other. And the British working class, you know, millions and millions of people who had never had time to have holidays barely, you know, like literally working all their life, no time, were forced to stay at home. Now, I know that obviously lots of people who worked in Tesco's and all the rest of it were working, but for millions of people who've never stopped working all their lives, they were forced to stay at home. And guess what they did? They couldn't speak to anyone, so they started using social media. And they started like saying, what do you think this virus is? Did it come from China? You know, asking all these questions, because the only way you could communicate with people wasn't like go and have a pint with your mates where you'd sort of say, do you think it's this? And people would say, what a load of rubbish that is, and you'd have a chat. So you were doing it, as it were, in public. And it was an entirely healthy way for us all to try and keep sane. Yeah. Because we were frightened. We thought we were going to die, right? You ask these questions, you'd sort of, it was a genuinely healthy thing to do, that you try and keep your intellect alive by trying to understand what the hell was happening in the world. And what do? They shut you up and they demonized you. And that was such a shock to people. They couldn't believe it. They were thinking, well, I'm only asking. I mean, why is that? And then they get some, you know, and then all these social media companies, somebody didn't see an interesting interview with a doctor in America, share it, and the next thing they were accused of being a conspiracy theorist. Sadly, that made a lot of people into conspiracy theorists.
So some people went too extreme in that. I get that. Do you think that mistrust is in our political system now? Going to the next question, you really care. What impact do you think politically lockdowns will have on this current government, you know, ahead of the next general elections per se? I know there's other issues we might touch on a little bit later, because obviously across the pages right now is Partygate. We might mention that a little bit later. But do you think that it's going to affect Boris Johnson's chance and the Conservative Party? Because, of course, they're in power. They're the ones who made the rules. We'll talk about breaking them a bit later. But do you think those lockdowns and the impact it's had both on the economy, on mental health in the country, and all those other aspects of businesses, small business, independent businesses going bust, even though there was some funds available, self-employed people who couldn't claim furlough. Do you think this will affect the Conservative Party ahead of the next general election?
Well, it should do. But you see, the problem is that they had cross-party support. You know, the Labour Party, you've already pointed out, ran Wales under Mark Drakeford. and anyway, the official Labour Party opposition of the UK, wanted more draconian lockdowns, they wanted less freedom than even the government were offering. In Scotland, we had the SNP doing the same. The Lib Dems were the most vociferous in terms of demanding compulsory mask wearing everywhere you went, all sorts of things like that. So what you're talking about is the whole political elite became implicated. So it's quite difficult then to just blame the Tories. I don't want to let them off the hook at all. I'm just pointing out that if anything, it's led to a disillusion with politicians and the political parties, but it hasn't led to the springing up of new political parties. It's more led to a kind of, you can't trust any of them type approach. The other thing is that whether we like it or not, the Conservatives will be given some credit for getting us out of it. Now, you and I might, because we were going on about it for 2 years, we might say, well, how can you congratulate Boris Johnson and the Conservatives for saying they'll eventually get rid of the Coronavirus Act when they brought it in the first place and it took them 2 years, or for lifting all restrictions. But the interesting bit was when they tried to do that, even late in the day, they were opposed by the Labour Party and the Lib Dems and the SNP. And Plaid Cymru and all these organisations said, it's too soon. Too soon. As a consequence, Boris Johnson has a smidgen of credibility for being associated with freeing us, even though, in fact, he'd locked us down.
Yeah, we got to talk about obviously what's on the front pages, and of course it's Partygate. Now, obviously, a lot of people got different opinions. Mine's just a very simple one. It strikes of hypocrisy to someone like me when any government or politician tells its citizens, you should do this and you can't go there, but they're doing the opposite. They make the rules and break the rules. And I'm not saying this from any political point of view, because I'm not with any particular party, Claire, as you know. But, and I take your point that Labour have not really been in any real opposition at all. And that's so we've got the worst prime minister, the worst opposition at the worst possible time. I mean, when you look at it like that, where are we going politically in our country? What's happening to democracy? Because people are less engaged with it now because they look at what happened at Partygate, for example, and think, how dare politicians tell me what to do when they're not doing it themselves?
I think that people do think that. There's been a huge reaction. They're right to be outraged at the contempt with which we were treated. I think it's that contempt, the idea that there was these rules that they were so uncompromising on. You'd go to those, you'd sit and watch those press conferences in which they'd ask somebody like Priti Patel, well, they arrested 2 people for going for a walk with a cup of coffee. And you'd think she'd say that's a bit OTT. She'd say, well, anyone who breaks the rules, they stuck with it, right? And then we found out subsequently what's happened. And you can be viscerally furious. But I also think it's an interesting observation that when the opposition, and, this is just the way politics is, at the moment, the people who are making most out of Partygate are those people who say people were dying alone, they weren't able to see their loved ones in homes. And you think you were advocating that. So it's very difficult to feel as though it's just anything other than just Tory bashing in the end. And I mean, I don't, as it happens, I want to bash the Tories, but one is distrustful of the drivers of this because the media that are going on about it and people's, hashtag Tory scum or Boris Johnson liar and all this, coming from people who also absolutely firmly advocated for both lockdown. And also we know that politics is complicated. So great hay has been made out of this by people who don't like Boris Johnson because of Brexit. And a lot of people have just been, we've all been following the media on it. But, on all the phone-in programs, you do get people who just say, we'll decide who the next prime minister is. We don't want this to be done by the media. That's what elections are for. So I don't know what will happen in May. I want the Tories to be held to account. And to a certain extent, I want people to be punished. But I don't think that a sense of vengeance is ever helpful in politics. And I think people react against when they see those kind of mean-spirited people who almost are enjoying Partygate because they think, great, it's a good way of getting rid of the Tories without having to win an argument about them. You just kind of use this moralistic guff.
Yeah, and I think the opposition using it, coming out, I can mention names like Angela Rayner and Keir Starmer. I mean, look, they were complicit in the lockdowns themselves, and they broke some of the rules. And I've had many conversations, pub conversations, the People's Parliament, and you say, well, yeah, we didn't comply. First lockdown, maybe we didn't comply because we saw through the nonsense, as some people describe it. But then their issue really is they didn't make the rules, and impose the rules. I think that's the big issue, isn't it? I want to come to that, the final part of our chat, Claire, and it's about Boris Johnson and his premiership. Obviously, at the start 2019, got an 80-seat majority, get Brexit done. It seemed to be going really well. Then the pandemic hit, then lockdowns and scandals, and there was all kinds of crazy things that happened in his premiership the last couple of years. As we know. But the question I want to ask you is this: will Boris be the prime minister, do you think, at the next election? Will the war in Ukraine save his bacon? That's what I'm asking.
Yeah, I don't know, but I think he's revealed a side of him that is incredibly damaging for his reputation as a man of the people who delivered Brexit, which is that he revealed during that whole lockdown period that he didn't trust ordinary people to make sensible decisions themselves, because I think that those people who think COVID was nothing are talking rubbish. But most people understood the seriousness of the virus, but then they wanted to be treated as grown-ups who could assess the level of risk that they lived with, as we do every single day of our lives in relation to everything from crossing the road to catching flu to anything else. And that lack of trust showed a contempt. And now we know that that was what the Partygate's all about, isn't it? It's about saying it's a horrible virus, but you can still get together occasionally. But we don't want to let the little people know that, in case they all go mad and they're irresponsible. On the war in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine puts a different complexion on politics in general, because it does indicate the serious big world issues, and it indicates why the international elites of all countries went a bit mad in COVID, and now suddenly they're confronted with a real crisis, and consequently whoever handles this war in Ukraine reasonably well will do reasonably well. And at the moment, Boris Johnson's in that position. But I think we've also seen in Boris a nanny stater we didn't know existed. He's carried on in that way through all of the stuff that they're doing on obesity, on public health matters, way beyond COVID. So he still kept that, in an unsavory fashion. And I think we should never forget that they introduced and have pushed net zero. I mean, you don't need Extinction Rebellion when you've got a Conservative Party that's made the environment like the most important issue. Since I've been in the Lords, more than COVID, more than any other issue, they talk about environmentalism all the time. And that's unforgivable, because it's led to an energy crisis that's going to have a massive impact on the cost of living, and, a direct impact. Lockdown, closing down the economy, the lack of foresight in relation to energy, they are the things which I think the Conservative Party should not be let off the hook for. The fact that we haven't got an opposition, though, means that I'm afraid that despite everything, Boris has got a longer life than he should have. But I think that he's exposed as, he's definitely not the great man of history that he always thought he was going to be. And he's lost a populist touch that he did sort of have a little bit. But whilst there's no opposition, and whilst, to be honest, the smaller parties just haven't made a breakthrough. And the reason they haven't made a breakthrough is they haven't got a sufficiently clear political agenda for anyone to see why they should be taken seriously. They're simply just saying we're small parties that want to make a breakthrough.
Yeah, and they don't seem to be making that breakthrough. I'm friends with a lot of those smaller parties, as you know, with their leaders as well. And, there's been conversations about working together. I'm supporting a number of independent councillors here in Wales because, they stand for liberties and all the things that I and you would believe in. And I struggle to find, as you've said, where is any real opposition going to come from? It paints a stark picture, really, for our democracy. It really does, because I don't know where it's going to come from. And, I've even thought to myself, Rich, start your own party, which I'll never do, by the way. I just feel worry, I'm not going to do crazy stuff like that. But sometimes you feel like that because you want to affect change, you want to make a difference. And through our current system, what we have in Westminster and here in Wales, it seems impossible, Claire, doesn't it?
I think that some of those independents you're talking about will make a bit of an impact. I think that the difficulty is that what happens in different countries is a bit like Marine Le Pen in France. Not a politician I have any regard for. And, people say they call her far right. Well, what's far right about her? Well, let me tell you, she's from the far right, and she comes from a background of open racism and anti-Semitism. But the reason why she's doing very well is not because the French public are anti-Semitic or racist, and she's tried to distance herself from those views from the past. I know that. But the reason why she's making a big impact is because people in France want an alternative, right? And the traditional alternatives just aren't cutting through. And so you'll get that. What happens is something will emerge in the UK. I don't know what it is. What I'm saying is the present crop of well-intentioned smaller parties aren't yet doing it. I mean, I try and, I spoke at the SDP conference, at Reform conference. I've kind of looked at all of these small parties, like Reclaim, all this sort of stuff. For me, it's not clear that any of them can do it, although I wish them all well. But what I do think is that the status quo can't hold. So you were saying to me about what's the state of democracy. We have to make sure that the one thing that doesn't happen is that people become so disillusioned that they go down the rabbit hole of withdrawing from public life and kind of, hanging around lurking in the dark shadows of conspiracy theories and all sorts of, anti-democratic ideas where they give up effectively. Yeah. They're a bit like a kind of like alternative to Extinction Rebellion. They don't think democracy works anymore, so they're just going to be as disruptive as possible. That's anti-democratic. That's what Extinction Rebellion does, which is they say you can't win anyone over. It's an emergency. We've got to do something. I'm afraid we just have to have faith in the general public that eventually they will begin to start looking around for alternatives and hope that something emerges. I'm too old to set one up either, but there will be new movements. History doesn't happen like that. New movements emerge. They do emerge, and I'll be watching and trying to hope that what emerges is a positive contribution.
Well, thank you, Claire Fox. It's been always a pleasure to have you on Rich Politics, and love your work. And of course, there's an event happening down in London on the 20th of April, I believe, Academy of Ideas, and it's the discussion around the whole Ukraine and Russia war. If you want to find out about that, folks, just Google Academy of Ideas. I recommend you get to it. I'll probably be there as well because I'm a member now. I've joined the Academy of Ideas, Claire. You know that, don't you?
I'm delighted.
Because I love it. I love the debate and open conversation. So please check it out. Baroness Claire Fox, thank you for joining me, and I'll speak to you again soon.
Thank you, Richard.